Welcome to Flourishing Fully Radio. I'm Sally Schutz. Today we're going to learn some new terms and new concepts on obesogens, a term coined in 2006 by Dr. Bruce Blumberg, professor at UC Irvine. He is a developmental biologist and a molecular endocrinologist. He's a specialist in some of the factors contributing to obesity today. We're going to look at the rise of chemicals in our environment that seem to be changing human metabolism. And we're going to explore this topic with him today. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Sally. Happy to be here.
How did you get started in your research on obesity?
Well, that's a bit of a long story. So we were studying the effects of chemicals on development. And in particular, I had previously identified a hormone receptor that regulates how the body breaks down chemicals. And in studying this receptor, we began to study a chemical called tributyltin. And when it was shown by a Japanese group that tributyltin could sex reverse fishes, we asked the question, what receptor could that involve? And we found out, to our surprise, that it affected a receptor called PPAR gamma and another one called RXR that work together as partners to regulate the development of fat cells. So there was only one place to go with those results, and we ended up studying chemicals in fat development.
And where do we find tributyltin today?
Tributyltin is still found as a contaminant in seafood. Personally, I think that the exposure is much higher from its presence as an accidental contaminant in various kinds of vinyl plastics. But no one's really measuring where it is and how much is in people. That's something that's not being studied. So we really don't know for certain all the places where it can be found.
So tributyltin is affecting how people's metabolism?
Presumably. We've only shown that it affects the metabolism of animals. But it does it in such a way that by acting on receptors that are also present in people, and we know that if you activate PPAR gamma in humans, the people get fat. So if you can activate it with a diabetes drug called Avandia that makes people fat, why would a chemical that works the same way not have the same effect?
Exactly. So why do you think there are so many obese people today?
Oh, I don't think there's one reason for that. I think that there are many possible explanations, many contributing factors. We know that, at least in the U.S., we don't eat as well as we ought to. We eat a diet that's very high in sugar that may contribute to obesity. We're exposed to lots and lots of endocrine-disrupting chemicals, some of which can affect the development of fat cells and can affect metabolism. We're subject to light pollution that disrupts what are called our circadian rhythms that affects weight gain. There are many factors involved. If it were one cause, it would be easy to fix. So, for example, if it was a simple matter of balancing your caloric checkbook, eat less calories, exercise more, would anyone be fat? Seriously? If it were that simple? I don't think so.
Right. So you have talked in the past about people gaining their weight back. What percentage of people gain their weight back after they've tried really hard to lose it?
It depends on the study, but anywhere between 88 to 95%.
That's really huge.
Yes.
And so now you're talking about something which I've heard you talk about before, metabolic programming. Could you go into that a little bit?
So the concept of metabolic program, you could make the analogy to a thermostat. Right? So you set the thermostat in your house to a certain temperature, and your heating, air conditioning system maintains that temperature despite whether you open the windows or whether it's hotter outside or colder outside. So you can think of your metabolism. So how your body utilizes calories is programmed early in your life, during your prenatal experience and during the years up till about puberty probably. So we know, for example, that people who were in their mother's womb and mom was starved, for example, the famous Dutch famine study, those babies will be born small, but will be predisposed to become obese later in life. And the thinking is that that's a that their metabolism has been altered to store more of the calories that they encounter as a result of that prenatal scarcity of nutrients. So that's the concept of metabolic programming. We've thought for a long time that obesogens might be affecting this. We've recently shown that, although the work's not published yet, but we can show that animals that are 4 generations away from the exposure will respond differently to a slightly higher fat diet than those that were not exposed. They will store more calories of the calories that they encounter.
Right, so you've done 4 generations of animals and exposed to an obesogen.
Tributyltin.
Tributyltin.
Pregnant mom was exposed to an obesogen, to tributyltin. 4 generations later, the descendants of that exposed mom all respond differently to calories. And we've repeated that now 3 times.
So do you actually find the tributyltin in the different generations?
Well, we don't look, actually, because it's difficult to detect, but the answer is certainly not. It's just not there.
It's not there. So you are exposed to it, it disappears, but its effects on your body persist for generations.
Yes.
That's incredible. So you've termed tributyltin and other chemicals obesogens. How did you come up with that?
I'd like to say that I thought carefully about it and looked at the Latin and Greek roots, but the reality is that when we discovered that tributyltin could make animals fat, it seemed obvious to us that it should be called an obesogen. I did not know at the time that it wasn't a word yet.
There you go. Well, we don't hear much about obesogens, so we've got to we've got to get that information out there. What other chemicals that we're exposed to? What other chemicals are obesogens?
Oh, there's a group of about probably 30 now. So we've shown in our recent paper that's just about to come out that there are a group of other fungicides that are obesogens, chemicals that we're exposed to on fruits and vegetables. DDT is known to be an obesogen. Fructose, obviously, is an obesogen. It's not an endocrine disruptor, but it's certainly an obesogen. You eat fructose, you're going to get fat. Rob Lustig has shown that very, very clearly. So there are quite a few chemicals that we know from a variety of studies make animals that are exposed to them gain weight. The mechanisms are largely unknown.
The mechanisms are largely unknown, even on the fat receptors?
I wouldn't say there's such a thing as a fat receptor, but for example, in our work, we've shown that in cells, if we treat cells with tributyltin and we block the activity of PPAR gamma, that the cells don't become fat cells. But we also know that that has no effect on this transgenerational programming of obesity, because PPAR gamma activators like Avandia don't do that, whereas a chemical that activates the other half, RXR, does. Okay. So it's a complex thing. You can't just point a finger and say, aha, we tickled the fat receptor and now you're going to get fat. It's not so simple as that. So there's a lot that we don't know.
For sure. For sure. Could you talk a little bit about endocrine disruptor for those people in the audience who haven't heard that before?
So I'm sure you're aware, and people in the audience are aware, that there is an endocrine system in your body. So the an endocrine gland is classically defined as a gland that secretes a hormone into the blood that acts far away from where it's produced. Classic examples would be estrogen and testosterone. So these act through specific receptors in the cells. And then humans, there are 40 different receptors, or receptor-like molecules. Molecules, we would say, this is probably a hormone receptor. And we know the hormones for about half of them. Oh. So the Endocrine Society defines an endocrine disruptor as an exogenous chemical that disrupts the function of the endocrine system in some way. Makes it too active, makes it inactive, makes it active at the wrong time. The Environmental Protection Agency adds the qualifier and causes adverse consequences. Now, to an endocrinologist, disrupting the endocrine system is per se adverse. To a toxicologist, which is who all the government guys are, well, you got to show me. You got to show me an adverse effect. Maybe it's not so bad. Maybe you can't really detect the effect. Because the entire field is largely designed to, I have to say, protect industry, to protect the producers of the chemicals. That's the way the law in the U.S. is written.
And these endocrine disruptors not only can cause obesity, but they can cause cancer and other illnesses as well.
And reproductive defects, so there's a whole host of adverse consequences that are associated with endocrine disruptor exposures. But if you ask a government toxicologist, they'll say, well, it's not proven, it's controversial.
Yes, well, that's classic. That's why fertility issues today have risen so dramatically.
So I can say that there's a strong association between the increased number of endocrine disruptors in our environment and in our everyday life and decreased reproductive function. To say that endocrine disruptors specifically cause that, that's more difficult to show in humans. I mean, you can't do such studies in humans, really. I mean, first of all, we don't want to be doing experiments on humans. That's not the way science works. Sometimes we have an accidental experiment. For example, there'll be an exposure of a population to a chemical. And then we can say, okay, what happened to those people that were exposed to this particular chemical? So, for example, that's how we know that mercury is bad for you, because of the exposure that happened in Minamata, Japan. That's how we know that polychlorinated biphenyls are bad for you, because there was an accidental exposure in Japan. And they could see in people who were exposed to this particular chemical via cooking oil that there were X, Y, and Z adverse consequences.
So a lot of information comes out of Japan, and by accident.
Yes.
I remember you have a story about being at a Japanese conference and something triggering some research ideas in you. Could you tell us about that?
So this was where tributyl happened. So the longer part of the story is we had been working with colleagues in Japan on endocrine disruptors and how they might activate our other receptor, the steroid and xenobiotic receptor, differently in different species. So this particular receptor that regulates your response to chemicals has some differences among mammals and between humans and other vertebrates, unlike other receptors. So the estrogen receptor, I could take the estrogen receptor out of a fish and put it in you or me, and it would work exactly the same. But this receptor SXR has some pharmacological differences. So that's really important if you want to say chemical X has an effect on mice, and therefore we predict it has the same effects on humans. You need to account for potential differences in metabolism and whether the chemical is broken down or not. So that's what we were working on. And my friend Tyson Iguchi in Japan had convinced the Japanese government to measure the concentration of 20 endocrine disruptors in every body of water in Japan. One of these endocrine disruptors was tributyl. So we were testing it on SXR from 20 different species that we had cloned and asking, is it metabolized differently? And the answer was, doesn't seem to be. But what happened was I was at this meeting in Matsuyama, very sleepily listening to talk. The whole meeting was in Japanese, and I don't speak Japanese. So I was trying hard to stay awake, fighting jet lag. And Professor Tanabe from Ehime University got up and he presented a talk about tributyl sex-reversing fishes. And that woke me up and got my attention. And I called back to the lab and I said, guys, test tributyl on all the receptors, not just SXR. And that's how we found it.
Wow, that's an amazing story. So tributyl is classified as an obesogen and an endocrine disruptor?
Yes.
Okay. How many endocrine disruptors do you think there are?
So this is something we don't really know very well. So we've accidentally discovered between 800 and 900 endocrine disruptors. So that's without a systematic testing of the 100,000 or so chemicals in commerce. So there's probably significantly more than that.
Could you give the audience a couple of names of the more common ones they'd be exposed to?
Classic endocrine disruptors, well, DDT is still out there, but What are you exposed to these days? Atrazine, bisphenol A, all kinds of phthalates. Um, those
The,
are
the phthalates are found in all the receipts that you handle. Is that
no,
right?
that's bisphenol A.
Bisphenol A,
Phthalates are found in most kinds of plastics.
most kinds of plastics. So it's really an upward battle to eliminate those kinds of things from your exposure.
Yes, it's doable, but it isn't simple because plastic is pervasive in our lives.
How do you do it?
I do the best I can. So we don't have any plastic at home that we store food in. We store food in glass and stainless steel bowls. Um, I have a stainless steel water bottle that I drink out of, although I confess that the water that goes into this bottle comes from a big plastic container that comes here periodically.
Does casual exposure to a plastic bag, we throw our vegetables into a plastic bag in the grocery store, does that casual exposure affect the produce?
Probably not, but that's something that someone should address. But my guess would be no,
Your guess would be no.
or not much.
Right. Um, and what is the regulatory community doing about this huge problem?
That's a difficult one. So they're studying it in their fashion. So, for example, a really good example is something that just happened recently. So, the International Agency for Research in Cancer said that the herbicide glyphosate, or Roundup, is a class 2A human carcinogen. That means very likely to be a carcinogen in humans. And the European Food Safety Authority says, we don't believe that because you've used the wrong kinds of studies. You've used academic studies and not rigorous toxicological guideline studies, which are so insensitive, you probably can't show any effect of a chemical in such studies. So they said, and the US EPA says, looks good to us. We don't see a problem. Monsanto says it's junk science, obviously because they make the stuff. But there's a huge body of evidence saying that there are adverse consequences to exposure to this particular chemical, which is the most widely used herbicide in the world. So in the US, we have a very strange law. So I don't know how much you know or your listeners know about US law, but you commonly think of the two standards in the law. So there's the standard in the civil law, which is you need to establish your case by a preponderance of the evidence, so that it's more likely than not that one side is correct. In the criminal law, the standard that we have is beyond a reasonable doubt. So that is beyond the doubt that a reasonable person, if there is such a thing, would have looking at these set of facts. In the chemical law, we have a completely bizarre standard which says that the EPA needs to demonstrate to a substantial certainty that a chemical causes harm in humans before they can regulate it. I don't know where that came from, that's by lobbying from the chemical industry. They know better than all of us, and we should have to show to a substantial certainty that a chemical is harmful. And by then, it's way too late. The damage is done, especially in the case of chemicals that have transgenerational effects. We're only just beginning now to understand that that's a possibility, and people are starting in a very limited way to study it because funding is not so available.
So Roundup, which contains organophosphates.
No, Roundup is glyphosate.
Glyphosates, yes. Glyphosates. They are considered to be both a endocrine disruptor and an obesogen?
I don't believe there's any evidence that Roundup is an obesogen. Certainly there's evidence that it's toxic and that it's an endocrine disruptor. Although the US EPA just decided that even though their testing showed that it has estrogenic activity, which should make it an endocrine disruptor, because the dose response was not linear, they said, must be wrong, so therefore it's not an endocrine disruptor. So this is another battle we have with toxicologists who insist that the response to increased dose of any chemical must be linear. So that's called monotonic. And I'm sure that every person in the world knows that there's almost nothing in nature that's linear. Nature is nonlinear. So to say that a dose response has to be linear is preposterous, and it shows the kind of mentality that we're up against.
Absolutely.
Only to a toxicologist should a dose response to anything be linear.
How long would the effects of these chemicals be in the soil? They're in the oceans, they're in our environment, so...
It depends on the chemical. So some of them are more persistent than others. So PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyl. So chemicals that have chlorines and fluorines on organic molecules tend to be very persistent. So they stick around for a long time. So there's something in Europe called the Stockholm Convention where they said that anything that's persistent should be banned because we don't know what effects it may or may not have, and because they're persistent, we can't take it back. So better not to let it out in the first place. And that's, in the U.S., it would have to be opposite. You have to show to a substantial certainty that it's harmful.
Going back to obesogens, which pharmaceutical agents are obesogens?
Oh, there's quite a few of those. So Avandia is one. So chemical that activates our friend PPR gamma is obesogenic. We know that atypical antipsychotics, there's a chemical called olanzapine. People on olanzapine therapy will gain 10 kilograms a year, 22 pounds a year. That's serious weight gain. Some kinds of antidepressants are obesogens. And one of the best lines of evidence to support the existence of chemical obesogens is that there are pharmaceutical obesogens. If a drug has a side effect of making you obese, then a chemical that acts via the same pathway is going to have the same effect. Because drugs are nothing more than chemicals that have been tested to have activity against a certain condition. They're no different from the rest of the chemicals that we're exposed to, except that a company tested them and took them through the whole approval process to show that they're beneficial to treat some condition.
I think a lot of people are familiar with the concept of things being toxic, and they go through detoxes. Can you differentiate how do endocrine disruptors differ from toxic chemicals?
Yeah, this is a very thorny issue. So, because let's use some examples. So, one example of a toxic chemical would be something that kills cells or kills animals. So, cyanide is a toxic chemical, right? So it disrupts electron transport. The organism can't make ATP and it dies. There are many other such examples of chemicals that when you treat cells with them, the cells die. So that to me is a toxin. But then there are more subtle effects, right? So what if I give you a chemical that disrupts it causes your estrogen receptor to be hyperactive and you get breast cancer? Is that toxic? Well, that's an endocrine disrupting effect, and it's an adverse consequence, but is it a toxin? So that depends on how you define it.
Right.
And that's kind of deliberately muddied by industry, who will say, well, water's toxic. People can die from drinking too much water. And my answer is, yeah, but it's not inherently toxic. So if you put water on cells, it's not going to kill them. So to me, something that's toxic has to have an activity against living things. It has to kill or make living things sick to be toxic in my, what I would call a classic definition of toxic. Chemicals that are bad at some dose that aren't inherently toxic, I wouldn't call them toxic, from my perspective.
Right. So do these obesogens and endocrine disruptors weaken the immune system?
That's something that's hardly studied at all. Some of them do, I would guess. So, for example, tributyl is regulated based on its toxicity to the immune system. That's a particular example. But there's not a lot of immunotoxicology studies.
It's an early area of investigation.
Partly it's that, and partly is, I don't know if you know how it is these days, but NIH pretty much across the agency is funding 10 to 12% of grants that it gets. So that means if you send a grant, you have almost a 90% chance of not getting funded. That's pretty difficult. If you want to do anything controversial, it's hard to get that funded.
Right. And how about the obesogens and endocrine disruptors on the mitochondria?
Again, not studied very much, but there certainly should be. Tributyltin is also a mitochondrial toxin.
And where does that have its effects on the inner membrane?
I couldn't say. I don't particularly know that.
Okay. How about the endocannabinoid system?
So there are chemicals that target the endocannabinoid system. I don't know who might be studying that with respect to environmental chemicals. But again, if you have a system that's regulated by receptors that bind to small molecules, in principle, you should be able to bring a small molecule from one of the 100,000 chemicals that could have some activity against that receptor. So I would predict that there could be such chemicals, but I don't know who's studying them.
Right. I know I'm going outside your area of expertise, but I just thought I'd probe a little bit.
Well, there's something called orphan G protein coupled receptors, which are it's a class of membrane hormone receptor. An endocannabinoid is one of those. Is one of those. There's something like 400 of them that we have no idea what they bind. So there's tremendous room for disruption of endocrine function by chemicals, and we've only just scratched the surface.
So for people who want to stay well, can you give us, I don't know, the top 5, 7 things that they can do to avoid these chemicals?
So for me, the number one thing that every person can do to stay well is to prepare your own food. That means don't buy something packaged, canned, whatever. That means go to the store, buy the ingredients, and make yourself a meal. Number one. Number two, if those ingredients are organic, so much the better. Right? We can't always get organic foods. We can't always afford organic foods. I shudder when I go to Whole Foods and drop $200 on a small basket of produce. I wonder why it has to be like that. So not everyone can afford that. So the job one is to make fresh food, because then you control what the ingredients are. If that food is organic to the biggest extent possible, that's going to be better because you will not be exposed to the various chemicals. That's not to say that there aren't certain kinds of chemicals applied to organic foods. There are some things that are allowed, and I don't know what all of them are. And the president of Syngenta Europe has been heard to say, I would never feed my children organic food. You don't know what's in there. Our pesticides are tested and they're safe. And I think, seriously, you believe that, fool?
I wonder what kind of food he eats.
Yeah, I wonder. So fresh food, organic is best. Get plastic out of your life to the extent possible. So don't store your food in plastic. Don't store your beverages in plastic. That's the easiest thing, right? Go back to glass and stainless steel. It's so simple. And it tastes better anyway. Would you rather taste water that's been in a plastic container in the refrigerator or in a glass bottle? There's a definite difference in taste. And the difference in taste is the chemicals that are leaching out of the plastic. And why those, I can't say with certainty that those are going to harm you. I can say with absolute certainty that you're better off without them. They're not helping you in any way. That's almost certain.
Absolutely. I'm sure you haven't done research on this per se, but do you think that the chemicals, let's say in our water, fluoride, chlorine, whatever else there is, interact with these endocrine disruptors and chemicals to make the effect exponential or increased?
That's possible. More likely is that they interact with organic molecules in the water and make toxic chemicals. Right? So halogens, chlorine and fluorine, can interact with simple organic molecules and become halogenated organic chemicals, which are known to be toxic, and water companies measure them. So the water suppliers have to measure whether those chemicals are in the water or not. So many of them are going away from the use of chlorine to sterilize tap water because of those side reactions. Now, of course, there's another consequence that we had. I forget which U.S. city it was not too long ago, but the water was making people sick. Why? Because there was a failure of sterilization. So it's something we take for granted, that you turn on the tap and you drink the water and you don't get sick. Try traveling to other countries. I was in Africa not so long ago, and you can't drink the tap water in many countries there. It's something we take for granted, and that comes with the negative consequence that if you use chlorine, you may create some chemicals you'd rather not be there. But the other side of the coin is, well, would you rather have cholera, or would you rather have trihalomethanes? Better that you don't have either one.
Well, you can purify your water here after it comes out of the tap.
You can, but to make it bacteriologically pure is not so easy.
No.
To make it chemically pure is very easy.
On another note, I remember you talking about a friend of yours who was able to eat everything, and he stays thin no matter what. Now, I don't know if he's eating organic solely or not, but certainly in some way or another he's exposed to these endocrine disruptors and obesogens. Would you surmise that there's a genetic protector mechanism for some individuals, that even though they're exposed, they don't seem to be affected by it?
So this is a very fascinating area of study. I'm not sure I would call it a protector mechanism. There was just a paper in Cell a few months ago, maybe not even 2 months ago, showing that different people respond differently to the same diet. That's so opposite to what the medical community thinks. So they were studying that they were trying to develop personalized diets for people who were diabetic. And they found out that each person had a particular response to the glycemic load in foods, and that it wasn't the same. That one person could eat a much higher glycemic load than another person, even though they were both diabetic. So this whole concept that we're different, right? It makes you hear about personalized medicine. So yes, we respond differently to drugs, and really it hasn't penetrated much beyond chemotherapy for cancer because it's kind of expensive to figure out. But the reality is we're different. We respond differently to the same exposures. You can have a population exposed to a virus. Some people will get sick, some people won't. Right? You could have a bunch of diabetic people, feed them the same food. Some will have very bad blood sugar outcomes, others won't. And you can't generalize based on the agent, the chemical, the food. You have to look at the individual. So to say that my friend who can eat anything in sight and not gain an ounce, he's protected from obesogens, maybe that's one side of the coin. But perhaps, really, he's compromised. Right? So this response, this ability of the environment to trigger your body to store more of the calories it consumes as fat than to burn them, that's probably advantageous in an evolutionary context. So imagine this guy and me, who tends to gain weight pretty easily, 20,000 years ago, right? Having to go out and get our own food. Which one of us is going to be at a selective advantage? Well, it's going to be me, because I'm not going to have to work as hard to get food. I'm not going to have to eat as much food, where this guy is going to have to be constantly foraging for food because he burns so much of it.
Well, of course, individual variation's been known. The Ayurvedics honor that concept, and some people eat by blood type. So, of course, there is individual variation.
But it's bigger than it's appreciated. So, the mainstream medical diet obesity community doesn't think anything of that.
Well, we're winding up, Bruce. Are there any things that I haven't touched on that you would like to touch on?
No, I think you've got all the major important topics. You've gone far afield and brought some things in we don't normally talk about, so that's good. I guess one message I'd like to leave is, it's not, yes, there's a lot of endocrine disruptors and obesogens in the environment. We're not doomed. Right? We have some control. If you expect government to step in and protect you, please don't hold your breath, because That's not going to happen. You need to act yourself to protect yourself and your family from the chemicals that are out there. And it's something that's achievable, especially if you're a woman of reproductive age who plans to have kids, who is pregnant, who has young children. That's the most sensitive window. So if that group of people, if young women who are pregnant, they become pregnant or have kids, are the ones who listen to this message, we're going to be better off. Actually, we have a review article coming out in a month or two in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology, which the reviewers were kind of resistant to our message, but we got past them anyway. So,
can you send me a link for that for our listeners?
yes.
Awesome.
When it's out, I'll send it.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you. Great conversation. And
thank you for your interest.
Oh, I have one more question.
Okay.
What would you say to our audience? It personally, this makes me angry, and I'm sure when others hear about it, it'll make them angry too. What can they do to be involved?
What can they do, or what can they achieve?
Well, take one first, and then the other.
Okay, so one thing you could imagine to do would be to lobby your local and state and federal government to take action. I think that's not a fruitful approach, really. Someone has to do it. We should do it. There's way too much money on the other side trying to keep the status quo. So I think what you can really achieve is to act locally. Take care of your family, tell your friends, support organic food, live a lifestyle that protects you. And in supporting the organic farmers, you accidentally, at the same time, support good farming practices, right? Because the way that we're farming with mass amounts of herbicides and no-till is destroying the soils. And that's not a good thing.
Absolutely. Well, the soils are definitely being destroyed. They have evidence of new fungus in the soil, new bacteria that weren't there before.
I'm talking more about just the loss of fertility.
Yes.
So the soils are becoming less able to support the growth of crops without large amounts of fertilizers, herbicides, things like that. That's not good.
Not good at all. How do the genetically modified foods play into all this?
That's a whole other can of worms. So to me, there's two kinds of genetically modified foods that you should think about. One are the ones that are genetically modified to resist herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, to express toxins. I think those are highly problematic. And the reason is because they encourage bad farming practices. They encourage things like no-till agriculture. Right? So the way that lots of crops in the U.S. are grown is you put an herbicide on the ground, kill everything, scratch a furrow, plant seeds that are resistant to the herbicide. They grow for a while. And then when you harvest them, instead of plowing that organic material back into the soil to fertilize and replenish it, it's just left there to rot. And then they'll spray herbicide again, and you break the cycle of replenishing the soil with the things that grew from it. That's a very big problem. I think that contrasts to things like golden rice, where you put the ability to make beta-carotene in rice. I don't have a problem with that personally, although some of my good friends are just blanket opposed to so-called genetically modified organisms. So I like to distinguish, and industry will try to lump them together. So if you talk about herbicide-resistant weeds, they'll raise, well, what about golden rice? They kind of deflect the argument. Monsanto would argue that having Roundup-ready crops greatly reduces the amount of Roundup that's used. And in fact, the amount of Roundup that's been applied in the U.S. has increased 100-fold since Roundup-ready crops came into existence. So, got to explain that, guys. What's going on there?
Right. Well, I hope that our listeners are going to pay attention to what they're eating, what they're handling, and
So too.
I want to thank you, Dr. Bruce Blumberg, for this very informative conversation.
You're welcome.